In this video, we engage how the Gospels, and specifically the Synoptic Gospels, were written. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they have a demonstrable literary relationship between one another. That is to say, it is clear that Matthew and Luke are using and copying from Mark, and they are also copying either from one another and from another source. So we're largely dealing with those three particular Gospels because we have this demonstrable relationship between the three, and we can see how Matthew and Luke are changing or editing Mark. Previously, we've talked about the Gospels being read in different kinds of ways, that they made for different kinds of reading events. And we've also talked about the different ways that people wrote in antiquity. What we're going to do in this video is take those ideas and apply them to the writing of the Gospels and see that the writing of the Gospels was complex, just as was the reading of the Gospels, which took place in multiple different forms. So also the writing of the Gospels is going to be complex and come about in different kinds of ways. So to put this in the form of a myth and reality, taken from chapter 6 of my book, Gospel Media, the myth is that the Gospels were all written using the same compositional practices. That is, they were all written the same way. And it's not necessarily that people continue to repeat this myth, that they say it or write it over and over and over again, but it seems to be more of a base assumption that all four Gospels, and particularly we're going to be looking at three of the four, Matthew, Mark, and Luke in this video, were all written the same way. So the assumption is there, even if it's not always stated. The reality, as we're going to see, is that the Gospels show sort of different compositional modes or different compositional practices. Specifically, the overarching argument is that the Gospel of Mark was composed by mouth, was written by mouth, and Matthew and Luke were written by hand, or that sort of more careful literary composition and editing went into the process of Mark. We should be reminded that the reading of the four Gospels was not the same, and that the four Gospels call themselves different things. That Mark labels itself a gospel or orally proclaimed news. So from its very beginning, it sort of makes a claim to being a part of the oral life world. Matthew changes Mark's title of gospel to book, making it something more literary and bookish from its very first word. Luke has a preface that indicates that it's written for an individual reader, who I believe was one single individual reader who would have then sort of began to circulate the text more widely, but that Luke was written for a private reader in mind. And John calls itself a document at the end of the gospel in order to sort of make a space for itself amongst other kinds of written documents that already existed. So we have in the Gospels themselves claims that they are different kinds of things, and I have argued previously that this means that they were probably read different kinds of ways. We're going to extend that argument and claim that the Gospels were also written different kinds of ways. We've seen previously different Greco-Roman authors sort of comment on the different ways that texts get composed, and we've also seen that when texts are composed by mouth, specifically by dictation, several authors say that this produces a sort of inferior and a not stylistic product. Another Greco-Roman author named Demosthenes, who we have not yet encountered, is going to make a similar claim about the particular text that they have written. So they say the whole essay, that is the book that you are about to read, is written as one would put into a book. Term biblos there, because discourses intended to be delivered orally ought to be written simply and just as one might speak offhand. So if you mean to have a discourse be reactivated in the oral mode, then you write simply and you write as if you are speaking. The best way to write as if you are speaking in the ancient world is actually to speak your writing, to dictate it. While those of the other kind, those that are appropriate for books, the kind that Demosthenes himself is writing, and they're planned to last longer, are properly composed in the manner of poetry and ornately. So Demosthenes is saying when you are writing something, when you are creating a written product that is not just meant to be reoralized, but is meant to be looked at by someone else with their eyes, they're going to engage the text visually, then you do a different kind of writing, that you are a little bit more careful in your writing, the kind of writing that Quintilian is going to suggest that people ought to do. And Demosthenes says his writing is that second kind of writing. If from Demosthenes we get the claim that there is a certain way to write literature, that those kinds of texts that are going to be viewed with the eyes, we get testimony from early Christian writers after the New Testament suggesting how the different Gospels came about, how they were written, what the circumstances were. And what's very interesting about these testimonies is that they tend to equate Mark with the oral life world, and they tend to use words that are more associated with literature when it comes to Matthew and Luke. So, for example, we have here Papias, who's writing in the 2nd century, and this is a piece that is embedded or excerpted and quoted in Eusebius's ecclesiastical history several centuries later. Papias says that Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered, all that Mark remembered, not indeed in order of the things said or done by the Lord Jesus. For Mark had not heard the Lord, nor had he followed him, but later on, as I said, Mark followed Peter, who used to give teaching as necessity demanded, but not making, as it were, an arrangement of the Lord's oracles. So that Mark did nothing wrong in his writing down single points as he remembered. For to one thing he gave attention, to leave out nothing of what he had heard, and make no false statements in them. So, Papias is here saying, Mark followed Peter. Peter used to tell orally the things that Jesus said and did, and Mark remembered those things and wrote them down. So Mark is writing down the things that Peter spoke. Here we have sort of a multimedia thing. Peter is speaking, and then Mark is taking up that speech later on and putting it into a textual form. Also embedded in Eusebius's church history is testimony from Clement, also from the 2nd century. And he says something similar about how Mark came about. He says, but a great light of religion shone on the minds and the hearers of Peter, so that they, the hearers, were not satisfied with a single hearing or with the unwritten teaching of the divine proclamation, but with every kind of exhortation, they besought Mark, whose gospel is extant or exists, seeing that he was Peter's follower, to leave them a set of notes of the teaching given to them verbally. Nor did they cease until they had persuaded him, and so came the cause of the scripture called the gospel according to Mark. And they say that the apostle, knowing by the revelation of the Spirit to him what had been done, was pleased at their zeal and ratified the scripture for study in the churches. So once again, we have Mark being a follower of Peter, Peter preaching things orally, and Mark writing those oral things down. The news comes to Peter that there is a written version of the things that he said aloud, and Peter says, that's great, I'm happy for that to be the case. And this is relevant, as we'll see later on, because oftentimes these sort of oral teachings that became writings were often used sort of in a plagiaristic or a dubious manner. But Clement is saying that's not the case with Peter and Mark. Peter was very, very happy for his oral teaching to be written down. And exist in the form of the Gospel of Mark. So the Gospel of Mark being written by mouth, sort of after the fact of Peter doing the speaking. Then we have a different, similar testimony from Clement embedded later on in Eusebius's church history. He says, when Peter had publicly preached the word, that is, orally preached the word at Rome, and by the Spirit had proclaimed the gospel, those present, who were many, exhorted Mark, as one who had followed him for a long time and remembered what had been spoken, to make a record of what was said. And that he did this and distributed the gospel among those that asked him. And that when the matter came to Peter's knowledge, he neither strongly forbade it nor urged it forward. So you have the same sort of basic testimony here. Peter is Mark is Peter's follower, and Mark writes up the things that Peter had said. So it is a record of what is said. It's a writing by mouth. And once again, Peter finds out that this writing exists. But in this testimony, he doesn't say it's good or bad. He doesn't say you can't use it, or he doesn't say publish it forward. He says, yeah, it's fine, whatever. And then Irenaeus is going to address all of the Gospels. He's going to give us little hints. He doesn't give us sort of a full-on testimony about each one, but gives us little hints about how each Gospel was composed and circulated. Starting with the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew brought out a writing of the Gospel. So notice the term writing there. There's nothing sort of oral about that. A writing of the Gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were proclaiming, that is, speaking, preaching the gospel in Rome and building the church. After their death, that is, Peter and Paul's death, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, this links back up to with our previous testimony, himself handed over us in writing the things preached, the things said. Again, there's a connection between what is said and what is written by Peter. And Luke, the follower of Paul, put down in a book. Notice that in a book is the very same phrase that Demosthenes uses. It's associated with literature, the gospel that was proclaimed by him. So there we do still have a little bit of oralness, but the in a book bit is key insofar as that is a reference to a way of writing literature, as Demosthenes says is appropriate for writing in a book. Then John, the disciple of the Lord and the one who reclined on his chest, also published his gospel while staying in Ephesus of Asia. So here Irenaeus has a strong connection between Mark, Peter, and the things preached, the orality. Matthew is bringing out a writing of the gospel, and Luke is writing the oral gospel the way that one would put literature into a book. And so what we find when we turn to the Gospels itself is that there are ways in which the Gospels sort of betray, or they show or portray the sort of more or less oralness to them, the way that they are more or less related to the oral life world. We've previously talked about how oral discourses will oftentimes sort of get expanded and corrected. That is to say, they'll get corrected as to their style if you want to sort of change them into something that's more important for writing. We've seen this testimony from Greco-Roman authors who say, if you just dictate, you're sort of creating a muddy stream. The thing is not stylized. You're going to have to fix it up. But oftentimes content gets added when you change something for writing. So here we have some statistics that I've gathered on how long each of the Gospels are and how long it would take to experience them in a performance or a reading. So Mark is around 11,000 words. Matthew and Luke are each a touch more than 40% longer than Mark, and they also read a little bit slower than Mark. So even though they are not sort of double Mark exactly in length, there's a sort of way in which they read slower, that not every document reads at the same speed. So Matthew and Luke are much longer insofar as they are adding stuff, they're adding content. And one of the things that they sort of especially add is teaching of Jesus. And Mark, it's very action oriented. Jesus is going here to there and doing stuff. Whereas Matthew and Luke are going to sort of slow things down and have Jesus do some teaching. So they're adding stuff in, and which would have made for a much longer reading or performance. Which sort of, in a way, supports previous arguments we've made about Matthew and Luke having different reading events associated with them than Mark would. So if Mark is sort of the type of document that is well performed in a single sitting, Matthew and Luke are much longer. Sitting through a 4-hour performance of Matthew and Luke is not going to be nearly as enjoyable an experience as is sitting through an 1.5 to 2-hour performance of Mark, which actually is really able to keep one's attention throughout the duration. We also see when we get down into the sort of nitty-gritty of the words that are used, that Matthew and Luke tend to alter the things in Mark that are associated with speaking. So we're going to look at two different things. One is the historic present, and the other is what is called parataxis. The historic present is using verb tenses that are in the present, even though one is talking about something that happened in the past. And this is a characteristic way of telling stories. If we're telling a story of something that happened in the past to someone else, one way that we try and make it more lively, that we sort of try and present it as if it's happening before our hearers' eyes and ears, is by bringing the story into the present. So we'll say things like, and he goes and he says, and he does this and that. That those says, does, goes are all present tense verbs rather than past tense verbs. He said, he went. So in oral storytelling, we tend to move into the present tense more often than in the written mode, which tends to more often be in the past tense. And we see this reflected in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, that Mark uses a high percentage, that 10% is a high percentage of historic presence compared to other kinds of literature. And specifically other kinds of narratives. So you see that this is over double Matthew's number of the historic present. So Mark is very often using a present tense verb for past tense. Matthew changes this often, not always. And then Luke very, very often changes this. Only less than 1% of Luke's total verbs are in the historic present. One of the things about the historic present is that we especially tend to use the historic present in what are called speech margins. That is when we are reporting speech. And it is more often the case, the historic present shows up in speech margins more often, both in speaking and in writing. It's still sort of seen as a touch inappropriate in writing, but it shows up more often there. And so we see this reflected in these numbers right down here, that Mark, Matthew, and Luke in speech margins, that is in words for say or speak, very often more often use the historic present. So this is a higher number than Mark's total. The same thing for Matthew and for Luke. The speech margins, present tense forms for speak or say, are more common than present tense verbs of other kinds of actions, which are indicated right here. But Mark still has a very high percentage of historic present tense verbs for past action, even when it comes to verbs not of saying or to speaking, which is not reflected in Luke. That those numbers are driven down a little bit more when it comes to Matthew and Luke. So what Matthew and Luke are doing, not only when they're writing their own unique materials, they are driving down those numbers of the historic present, but when they're editing Mark, when they're taking material over from Mark, they will very, very often change those historic presents into past tense verbs in order to make them more appropriate for the written or literate medium. And the same is true of the word kai. This is the word and in Greek. When we tell stories aloud, because we are trying to vocalize our thoughts, we tend to do it in a really choppy sort of way. And this happened, and that happened, and this happened. Because our mind can only hold on to one idea at a time, and then it bounces to the next one. And the easiest way to bounce to the next one is to just connect it with and, rather than to put it in some kind of complex grammatical relationship. When we speak, we tend to just move along going and. Writing, in contrast, tends to subordinate things. And so what we're going to find is that in the Gospel of Mark, kai is used far more often. That's what these numbers are, that it's 1 in every 10 words for the total volume versus 1 in every 15 and 1 in every 13 for Mark and Luke, but especially at the beginning of new units, at the beginning of new sentences, and about the beginning of what we would visualize as a paragraph. So that kai and begins 65% of the sentences in Mark, and only 21% and 30% of Matthew and Luke, respectively. And then when it comes to new paragraphs, sort of like whole new episodes, 92% in Mark as compared to 21 and 32% in Matthew and Luke, respectively. And what this also leads to is a total sort of depression of other kinds of more complex connectives or conjunctions in Mark, so that and is almost 2 times more common than other things like because or therefore, the sort of more complicated way to relate two clauses or sentences to one another. Whereas other connectives are more common in Matthew and Luke. We see them using things like therefore and putting the different sentences into more complex relationships with one another because they are slowing down the process while they are writing by hand, that they're sort of visualizing what's going on, and they're able to put their different clauses and episodes into complex relationship with one another in a way that Mark doesn't do because it is marching forward sort of in the more simple oral mode. And so to draw out some conclusions about all of this with respect to how the Gospels were written, I think my argument is that Mark was written from antecedent oral events, one or more antecedent oral events, and it's meant to be in the oral mode. There's a reason that Mark continues to work in oral performance really, really well. Those that sort of do performance criticism, Mark has long been a favorite of the performance critics because it was originally sort of in that mode and continues to find success in that mode. Moreover, this is the testimony of the early church. Papias and Eusebius, they're all sort of saying that Mark came out, the written version of Mark came out of Peter's oral speech. So they make that connection between orality and textuality with respect to Mark in a way that they don't for Matthew and Luke. There's also evidence to this kind of writing from Greco-Roman antiquity. We've seen that this was a way that people wrote intentionally or unintentionally, that one could dictate and intentionally have their spoken words written down, or one could write by mouth in a way that is less intentional, that the things that they said in a teaching context happened to be written down by someone that was there or by some students who really, really liked the teaching. And that seems to be the sort of testimony that many of the early church figures are sort of alluding to that sort of practice of eager students writing down what their teacher had said. And then this is reflected in the gospel itself, as we saw with those statistics, that there is a sort of oral style to Mark that is not reflected in the other synoptic gospels to the same extent. So Matthew and Luke, they sort of systematically edit out these features of Mark that sort of smack of oral storytelling. They remove the excessive number of ands, or in Greek that's kai. They also depress the number of historical presents and change those to true past tense verbs. They make their gospels longer by adding more content in, specifically more teaching content. And another thing that they do that we didn't really talk about in this video is they also embed older texts in a more exact way. So when they do things like quote from the Old Testament, they're going to take an Old Testament quotation, they're going to visualize it and have it, they're going to know its exact form, and they're going to plop it into their Gospels in a more exact way than Mark does. Mark tends to be a little bit inexact in the way that it alludes to the Old Testament. It does so in a sort of echoic or elusive kind of way. Matthew and Luke are going to sort of tighten this up. And the sort of what comes out of all this is that Mark seems to have been created not only from oral events, but in a way continues to find success in oral retellings. And Matthew and Luke seem to have been more associated with sort of the production of literature by hand, the sort of careful literary production that is more concerned with sort of exactitude and well-edited words.